So thank you very much for inviting me to speak at the training camp. I would love to be with you in person, but as you know, it is a new government and it is quite busy down here at the Department of Health and Social Care. I caught the tail end of Jane's presentation, which I thought was excellent, and it's as if we had been through similar experiences, which I suspect we have, and really there are some common themes which I hope will be useful. So as I hope you might have heard, I couldn't hear the introduction. I'm Chief Exec of NIHR, but I'm also Chief Scientific Advisor at the Department of Health and Social Care. But I also have another life. I'm still a Professor of Obstetrics at King's College London and a Consultant Obstetrician at Guy's and St Thomas's. And every Wednesday I go back to my home of sort of running clinical trials in pregnancy and being an obstetrician in an antenatal clinic. So I think in sort of similar to as Jane was describing, there is if you look, if you hear those job titles, it would be really easy to think there had been some straight line from where I was as a PhD student to where I am now. And it couldn't be further from the truth. There have been so many unexpected sort of wiggles in the road, and some quite major ones as well. And so I sort of was just asked to reflect on what those might look like. I think rather than just being a jumbled mess, one of the things that I would note would be the chasms. And some of what I want to talk about is where do we find those bridges from and how do we cope when things are tough? And I can tell you that I've had some really difficult times when I've questioned whether I should stay in medicine or in academia. And I am still here. And I've had 3 children. I've worked part-time for 10 years. And it's about what keeps us going, probably what gets me up in the morning, which is making a difference, particularly to patients and the public. So finding those bridges for me, it's sort of in the PhD to postdoc transition, came from a whole number of different ways. I picked up a Chadbourn academic clinical lectureship, which is one bridge, but there are many other similar bridges of sort of fellowship funding. Jane mentioned sort of going from one fellowship to another, which does happen for some people, but not for others. You might go to the NIHR academic clinical lecturer program or the parallel ICA program, but there are some other bridges such as the Development and Skills Enhancement Award, which I've used for one of the postdocs in my group, again, which give that sort of a different sort of bridge. So you heard about the triad, that it is the magic triad because you have to say, are you the right person for this? Are you in the right place? And do you have the right project? And I liked the 4th P of, but can you persuade someone else that's all the right fit? But I'm going to sort of give some advice which I've learned over the years, which is when you are doing your PhD, there is a tendency and a view from some that you might want to continue to do more of the same, perhaps in a more niche sort of sub-area. You've learned so much during your PhD. For a brief period, you are the world expert on that topic. And it's very tempting to stick in your comfort zone, to see that funnel narrow down. But I'm going to put to you that actually I think it should be the other way around. So I talk to my sort of final year PhD students and I say, tell me about if you want to progress, why wouldn't you want to expand your methodology, your topic area, the discipline or who you work with, which institution you might be in, the setting, secondary care into primary care, the age range. Why wouldn't you want to increase that funnel? And particularly for those who want to be research group leaders, you need to increase that funnel. So you need to widen your skill set, not to narrow it. That is not what all supervisors say, and it's not what all postdoc hiring say, because sometimes they say, well, you knew what you were doing in your PhD, do more of that. So I encourage you to go, onto our website. If you haven't seen our sort of the video on our front page, it's at the top, just to sort of remind you of what we're here to do, which is often wider than what your PhD has been in. For some, particularly those in a clinical area, they're also moving from being PhD typically 100% of your time. Now that might be less than full time, so it might be at 70 or 80%, but you may well be into juggling it with a clinical job. So there are many other things that in that transition from PhD to postdoc. So you may end up getting back-to-back fellowships, but it doesn't always work like that. And for some, it isn't always what they choose. So we have an offer on the NIHR in terms of all sorts of fellowship opportunities, and that's great. But actually, particularly if you're still in write-up or sort of in write-up but haven't got your Viva or haven't got everything published, there are other opportunities to look at project grants. And for some, that is a different next step in their academic journey. I am completely aware that that project grant funding is not always the most sustainable route. For example, if you're trying to get mortgages, but we can try and address that within our NIHR, but it is a higher education institution or an NHS bigger challenge. So I'm not saying it's a panacea, I'm saying it is an option to think about fellowships to project grants and back again. And the reason for that is that if you're in a PhD fellowship, if you go out and get some experience in project grants, you will be more competitive and better placed to understand what you want to do your next fellowship in. So understanding that zigzag of the career pathway can actually be helpful. For me, at postdoc level, I was also putting lots of different eggs into lots of different baskets. So I'd done my PhD in preeclampsia, but the opportunity came along to put in for a clinical trial in maternal medicine. And I took the opportunity because it was working with a really good trialist and a really good scientist, and we got the grant. And it taught me a whole load of parallel skills, as broadly still clinical trials in pregnancy, but I learned a huge amount about running a drug trial that has turned out to be very useful. So sometimes you acquire skill sets through a whole range of different ways. So what steps do I think you can take? So my first one is about going back to this point about broadening your horizons. So be inclusive, be multidisciplinary, think about team science, think about collaborating. And team science has been a theme of the NIHR Academy, and we're seeing really interesting ways of working. So look at who provides health and care in the topic area that you are considering and say, have you got that right multidisciplinary team around you? Vice versa, if you are one of those other disciplines that may not typically have had a seat at the table, how do you go and find the people who are writing the grants and getting the grants and saying, you need me. If you don't realize you need me, I'm telling you that I am part of the care team, the health and care team, and I can bring something to your project, or can we collaborate on a fellowship? One of the ways we can do this is to think about increasing your opportunities, but also mitigating the risk. So if you're an early postdoc, you're broadly high risk to give a big project grant to because you don't have a track record, but you can mitigate that by being a joint lead applicant. And a joint lead applicant can work in a number of ways. Here's some guidance from our RFPB program, where you can either do joint lead applicants as junior senior, but you can also do it across two different disciplines. Again, one junior in your discipline, one senior in a different discipline, so that you are strengthening your application. And this is something that we've really pioneered, and I think really adds value both to the project in terms of the impact for patients, but also to the individuals. I've talked before about trust, and for me, this is crucial to that collaborative research culture. And when I was stepping out in those postdoc days, I found it hard to know who to collaborate with. And sometimes I collaborated with people because they were the big names, but they weren't actually the people where I got the best science done. The best science comes with trust because, as you've heard, there's credibility. You know what you're talking about. There's reliability. The actions happen. There's also this concept of intimacy, which is you feel safe to share your best ideas because you don't think that somebody's going to run away with them. And on the underneath is that self-orientation. If you have people who are highly egocentric, it doesn't make for good collaborations. But if you have people who all want to work together, great things happen. How do you pitch to what might float our boat in NIHR? So we've got 7 areas of strategic focus at the moment. These were from the strategy document, Best Research for Best Health, and they remain as valid and important as ever. So for example, with the incoming government, you'll see this real interest in preventative healthcare, moving from treatment to prevention. I think moving from hospital into the community, home, primary care, and other areas. You see the demographic shifts that we're facing, and therefore we need to think about multiple long-term conditions. Thinking about all of these areas are still very important. But we also have emerging areas and new priorities. So, for example, in January 23, we published DHSC's areas of research interest. We've got calls out at the moment we've had calls out on compound pressures, on workforce, really recognising these emerging areas of work. And then go to our funding opportunities page. So I just clicked on it last night when I was making my slides. Now, technology-enabled social care highlight notice. Who do we think is going to apply? I want all of you to be curious, because you may come in to apply for that from all sorts of different avenues. And I both want people expanding their horizons, but also working with others. So you might be working with, for digital technology, with all sorts of system engineers or others, where you might need to go and find new people to pull into this area. You can work out what your red thread is. Health inequality should underpin much of what we do, and it might be a particular area of health inequalities. I'm not signaling that this is the only one. I'm signaling it as an example of how do you do something that you feel sort of strongly about, passionately about, and make it count. And you'll see that we launched the NIHR challenge around maternity inequalities based around the core 20+5 that is published by NHS England. That is the first of one of the core inequalities that it calls out, and so we are currently that is going through commissioning at the moment. We're really clear about our commitment to equality, diversity and inclusion. We've published our strategy, and we've published a number of toolkits to make it happen. So this is not going to go away, because it's what matters for this. It's right for the impact for patients and public. It's right for the scientific impact. It's not smart just to do research on a very narrow subsection of our population. And it's also right, if you look at thinking about the adoption of findings, you need that inclusive population in research, which is best served by an inclusive researcher population. I learned the hard way about meaningful co-creation with patients, because it should be at the heart of what we do. I put an application in before I got this chief exec job around antihypertensive use in pregnancy. And I got it rejected, I think, 3 times. And I put another stage 1 in, where we had really seriously co-created the primary outcomes with patients through a whole range. And I learned that unless I could demonstrate, be persuasive, as Jane said, about that co-creation, we hadn't done our job. We've got incubators, and if you're in the incubators, go to areas where we know that they need a bit more love. So if you see yourself on this list, or if you're curious, because sometimes these are areas, I look at something like community rehabilitation, where I know that people will be coming in from all sorts of different disciplines. And that is one of the huge virtues of NIHR, that we are an inclusive funder who wants to get these communities together. I think one of the other things that you can do, and start to do at postdoc level and beyond, is think about how you, either in the NIHR or with other charities, other funders, do reviewing, either for journals or for grant reviews, or look at committee vacancies. There are different opportunities for different career stages. So I'm not saying that all committees are open to immediate postdocs, but go and have a look at what is available. It is a hugely valuable part. I was an editor for a couple of journals, and then I did some grant reviewing, and then I joined as a RFPB member, and then went on to be chair of the HTA Trials Committee before this role. So it was a whole range of roles that helped me write grants and write manuscripts. Just going to touch on what I had in an earlier slide, which is a shadow CV versus a failure CV versus a narrative CV. So this idea was sort of one of the early publications was back in 2010, when somebody boldly published in Nature about, you don't see the rejected grant applications and the rejected manuscripts, but all of us have them more than you understand. And when I have to hold hands of my group through a rejection, I often tell them about some of the grants that I thought were fantastic that didn't get funded. there is a view that rather than calling it a failure CV, you might call it a shadow CV, which is partly about what you did to overcome either the challenges, some of which I am absolutely aware of may be systemic inequalities. I don't think we've got it fixed yet, and there's all sorts of ways in which we should tackle those systemic inequalities. And using the narrative CV is an interesting idea to contextualize what you have done along the way, and to make it possible for us to really reward a sort of a much more diverse group of researchers than we typically have. And I can understand, I mean, I remember when I was working part-time, I did not necessarily trumpet it because I didn't think it would go down well. And now I am much more open. It's easy for me to say about that, about running life alongside our work, and it doing what I can to say we actively want that diversity. So I come back to the what's the point, and the point is the impact. And we keep a page on our website called Making a Difference, and I just off the front page I picked four examples. One about primary care research, one based on a fellowship, a clinician scientist award, one about where research has really made a difference at the NHS cutting edge, and one about thinking more broadly about not just a very narrow definition of health, but thinking about sort of the needs of social care research and how we are trying to do so much more in social care, and trying to make sure there's a home for everyone who takes part in health and social care. I finish with a quote from one of my teenagers, which I've used before, but I looked at this and thought, you know what, it's as relevant today as it ever has been. I have applied for jobs and not got them. I've applied for grants, for submitted manuscripts, and my teenager sent me this. And it's why I'm here today, and it's why this is the advice you need, particularly as you go into postdoc. And I really hope that NIHR does everything it can to have a facilitative and enabling approach. We cannot fund everyone. Our funding rate is not 100%, and it never will be, and it never should be. But we can constantly strive to ask, how do we support the careers of as many of you as possible to make a difference for patients and the public? So thank you very much. I'm very happy to take questions, and I hope that's been some useful reflections. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Lucy. That's perfect. And I think talking about the funnel effect between a postdoc, doctoral to postdoctoral to beyond is incredibly relevant. Do we have any online questions? No online questions? Questions from the audience? The in real life audience versus our virtual audience. Now, Lucy, can I ask, so we obviously invest a lot in people and developing fellowships, but that idea that it's this pathway that you go from one fellowship to another, it's not for everyone, is it? And it's and you highlighted those opportunities around being on grants. How can we get that message out more, that it's not necessarily just about fellowships?
So I think it's about thinking, I don't think it's the right career model to have a straight-sided pyramid where everyone who comes in at the bottom end in a doctoral research fellowship comes out the top end as a professor, because it's not the right career choices. And I think we should ask ourselves, how do we have a organic, porous system of opportunities? So for some people, they actively like that opportunity to work in a project grant so that they can expand an area. They can try before you buy was the phrase I was thinking of, test an area, get some experience of working with different colleagues so that they can make a better decision if they want to go back into a fellowship. So, I was slightly hesitant because I completely understand that short-term contracts have their own challenges, but I think it's about saying, let's not judge everyone by the same criteria, which is that success equals professorship. I don't actually agree with that, and I think that where I think we could do more work is, for example, people coming in and out, and I know something, Anne-Marie, you've looked at, is hybrid roles, zigzag, so that people go back into clinical. Some of our PhD students in my specialty, which is a craft specialty, go back into clinical because they want to get some clinical years, a few clinical years under their belt, and then they want to come back into academia. So let's not assume there's a one-size-fits-all pathway. Let's look at that, those opportunities for people.
Thank you. No questions? Could I also kind of just speak a little bit about this co-PI? There seems to be a myth that we can't have co-PIs as more junior researchers, and certainly that's cross-funded. So I think that's a bit of a game changer, to know that you can actually be a co-PI even if you don't have funding, and that extends beyond that length of the grant. The expectation is you would take that grant activity with you elsewhere. Are there any other ways? Oh, sorry, go on.
I mean, that's a tricky one, and it's worth looking at the guidance and understanding how we try. I mean, for example, one of the things is we have to contract with a single organisation. I mind less about who is the one, that you have one lead PI on the front page and another joint lead applicant on the page too. If you are joint, I learned a lot of what I have acquired as a chief investigator when I was a joint PI, but named as the second one. It doesn't matter. It's what you do. It's the delivery of it that counts. So I think understand that as an organisation, we contract with one organisation, but it's about how you deliver the project that matters.
And certainly I think NIHR is very good at encouraging that collaboration. Certainly you will know as part of the infrastructure that our BRCs are expected to collaborate with other BRCs, the ARCs expected to collaborate with the ARCs, and there's incentives for that, and I think that's absolutely appropriate. We have the Chief Scientific Officer here. Any questions? Yes, thank you.
Thank you, it was a very interesting presentation. You mentioned about broadening your horizons. How do you navigate conversations like that with a supervisory team? So I'm coming to the end of my PhD and I'm considering changing age groups, but obviously all my team works within one particular age group. And I don't know, I'm a bit nervous about kind of letting them down by completely changing area.
That's such a good question. And I think the way I would frame it is, how can we expand the impact and for example, bridge that gap? So how do we take the expertise that you have in one team and reach out to another team in a way that's not threatening? You're not turning your back on your current team. You are building wider bridges. Now, the majority of people are open to that. I'm well aware that some people think that I'm giving heretical advice, but my honest experience is that most people see this as an opportunity. But if you think about it, if you funnel down at the PhD to postdoc, you're narrowing your options as to where you can go next. So it sort of makes completely logical sense that even though you're expert in that area, you may need some help, and you may need to frame it as look at the opportunity that will come with this. And you do sometimes have to go and do some cold calling. But imagine if you were changing age range and you wanted to go and meet those people, I don't know, go from adults into children and young people. Imagine what you can bring to those people working in a paediatric setting and saying, you've got some expertise, I've got something, are you interested? And you often might need to try that a few times. Or if you're going from secondary care to primary care, respect the expertise of the people you're approaching, but also say, what have you got that you can bring? But usually, if you get a good reception, keep going. You don't always. Try something else, try someone else.
Brilliant. Oh, all of a sudden we've got a whole lot of questions. Lucy has a hard finish at 4, so thank you.
Thank you. Just going back to your point about being part-time, I'm just wondering how we can best, as a part-time clinical academic myself and a full-time mother, how do we best support part-time staff to progress their academic careers while still just recognising the skills that we can bring without it being seen as a second-rate person?
So I often describe it as full-time commitment in part-time hours. And actually, if you think about it, all of those who are clinical academics are already part-time because they're already doing clinical, say, for 50%, and they do 50% academic. So the concept of part-time is not foreign, but you get labelled, as I'm well aware and I've lived through. There is no single magic bullet, but I often used to say it's full-time commitment. And when and I know for example, I was the main carer, and so if a child was sick, then we all take a hit. So it's about what you do bring. I would say it's not just about childcare. People have got other caring commitments outside of work. We should be inclusive and generous to people, whatever their other commitments, and just look at how to maximise the opportunities. I actually think that those with other commitments out of work are extremely efficient and effective, and saying there is a place for everyone, whether they're full-time or part-time. So it's about judging people on their delivery appropriate to the hours that they're working, not judging them on the number of hours they work.
Brilliant. I'm afraid that's all we'll have time for. Can I just also say that that's where the contextual box comes in. It used to be seen as being, you wouldn't want to necessarily say you'd had kind of carer's leave or responsibility. Please do, so that we can contextualise the things that you've been doing. Lucy, thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
And I'll fess up, Anne-Marie, that I'm going to go and speak to Treasury at 4 p.m, which is a good place to go and be talking to, because I love championing what we are doing. And I will tell them that I've just come from talking to a room full of inspired and inspiring researchers, because you are the future and we want to invest in you. So I will go and talk to the Treasury about getting more money.
Brilliant. And that's the call starting. Thank you, Lucy.